Here's an encounter from a writer who wants to be anonymous, and here's what he writes. Listening to your channel has given me the courage to get this off of my chest. It happened in 2003. I was living in a small town in the central Piedmont of North Carolina. There was a modest brick home in a somewhat secluded area in a heavily wooded part of Iredell County. My nearest neighbor was 200 yards away through a small patch of pine trees. Aside from 2 cornfields directly across the road, everywhere else was a mess of older hardwood trees. White-tailed deer were abundant, and most every evening they would come and eat at the edge of the fields. I made it a habit to sit on my porch and watch the deer before dark whenever I could. Twice I remember seeing them getting spooked and scramble across the field after hearing an extremely loud sound that I can only describe as part moan and part scream. At the time, I wondered if the mountain lions were in this part of the country. My neighbor was a few years older than me. He lived in a beautiful 100-year-old Victorian-style farmhouse that was situated on 15 acres adjacent to my land. His name was James. He was ex-military, having been discharged in 1999. We were pretty good friends. When he was away, I'd take care of his animals and property, and he'd return the favor when I had to leave town for work. One Saturday afternoon, James called and asked if I wanted to do some shooting with my new air rifle. Of course, I replied. It was early October and the squirrel season was coming up. It was 5 o'clock that Saturday evening when I walked over to his house. James had an old barn that sat across the road and approximately 70 yards from his porch. He hung an old cast-iron frying pan from a tree that overhung a four-wheeler trail beside the barn that we normally use for .22 rifles, but we thought it might be fun to use it with the air rifle. We dialed in the scope and took turns shooting at the frying pan. It proved to be an easy task to make it ring pretty loud with each shot. I had just made it ding 3 times in a row and had the rifle in my lap when we heard it ding again. Well, James looked at me and I looked back at him. We were at a loss. It dinged 2 more times and stopped. James took the rifle and fired twice and made it ding twice and sat it in his lap. The pan dinged 2 more times. James looked over at the pan in the fading light and said, "Someone's messing with us." He went inside and came back with a huge battery-powered spotlight. He said, "Let's go find out who it is." We crossed the road and walked over to where the frying pan was hanging at the start of the trail. He shined the light into the edge of the woods, but we didn't see anything at all. "Who's there?" he yelled into the darkness. Limbs crunched 20 yards to the right of the trail. James swung the light toward the sound, and we both saw eye shine that was impossibly large. They were a good 7 feet from the ground. It was then that we we actually felt a low, menacing growl that vibrated through my chest. It was like a jake brake on an 18-wheeler rattling my insides. We looked at each other and decided we needed the safety of his porch. The next day, James went over to the frying pan and found several smooth rocks on the ground beneath our target. They had to have come from the creek, but the creek was a quarter mile into the woods. I'm thinking Sasquatch liked to take target practice too. I lived there until 2014, and only once after the frying pan incident do I remember hearing a strange, laughing-type howl one night. I'm sure I'm not the only one in North Carolina who has heard these creatures. After all these years, I thought I would have been able to forget about it, but that bone-shaking growl is something I guess I'll never forget. I feel better for having told it, and thanks for letting me get it off my chest. Well, you're welcome, Mr. Anonymous. That was a good story. You know, actually, I'm going to go ahead and put this story in a podcast, but as I got about 3/4 of the way through it, I think I've done this story before. And it may be that I didn't archive it in my email list. That happens. And I come on these stories and I get halfway or 3/4 of the way through them and I'm like, oh man, I've done that one before. But there it is again. There may be a lot of people who haven't heard it, and I hope you enjoyed it because it's real interesting to me. It's the first one I've ever heard of something like this happening. And it sounds like a Sasquatch is just having fun with some shooters. I guess he was, close to the target or at some distance to the target where he could have got hit by a ricochet or a straight through shot. But apparently they know what their limits are, and they were just messing with them with that old frying pan. But I thought it was a great story, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Welcome to another video. My name is Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid YouTube podcast or YouTube channel. I've got 3 stories in this. You just heard one. Let's move on to the last 2. I think you're going to enjoy them. All right, here we go. This writer is anonymous too, and here's what he writes. This is really good. I was a young boy when this encounter took place, but I still think about it. It was late spring, and I was 7 years old. My father decided to take me to our favorite camping area in an isolated spot deep in the mountains of Trinity County, California. The campground has since burned in a forest fire and is no longer in use. Deep in the backwoods forest, there was a small prairie. Grouse Prairie, as it was called, was an enchanting place. You had to travel up an old service road and through logging roads to get there. A small creek came down the mountain and cut through the prairie, and we had camped there many times, and we were familiar with it. We arrived a little after 10 a.m. and began to set up our camp. Our dog came along on these camping trips. He was a big, thick-bodied black lab. The dog began making his rounds and scouting the campground and sniffing everything in sight. He was doing what dogs do. Once camp was up and after lunch, we went on a quick trek through the woods. Everything was fine for the first couple of hours until something changed in the air. The birds went quiet. The dog became uneasy. We were still a ways from the prairie area, but we trudged ahead, and a bit further down the trail, the air began to feel heavy, and Smokey, our dog, started growling. It wasn't until we made it into the prairie that the heavy feeling in the air became a feeling of being watched. And in the middle of that prairie, even though I felt creeped out, I stopped and I began taking it all in. It was beautiful. I scanned the edges of the woods, and in one area I saw a shadow of a large person hiding behind a tree. And I yelled out to the person. That got my father's attention, and he turned to see who I was calling to. But by then the shadow was gone. Then we heard it running and tearing through the trees. Well, I thought that was unusual, that something would make that kind of noise going through the woods. The dog's hackles went up and he pranced around the area sniffing and growling, but the rest of the afternoon was uneventful. The next day things were calm. My dad and I did some target practice in the morning, and then we went on another hike, sticking closer to camp this time. We returned around 5 p.m. and began making supper. While we ate, we could hear crickets and other critters in the distance. It was calm and it was pleasant. It was the perfect place to be in that moment. But like a light switch being flipped, the sounds of the woods went silent. I could hear the blood even flowing through my eardrums. It was so quiet. I watched Smokey low crawl like a bird dog creeping up on a covey of birds over to a thicket of brush by the creek. He looked like a razorback pig with all that hair standing up on his back. He stopped just short of where the thicket began, and he remained motionless and growling and shaking. Something was in there. Dogs don't do that for the hell of it. There was an odor now present about the area that made me want to gag, and my father stood up and armed himself with a pistol he carried in his vest. Smokey burst off into the brush, growling and huffing. That scared me more than anything. It let me know there was something in there. Dad moved to the brush thicket with his pistol in position. He was almost there when Smokey yelped and whimpered off in the brush. And then a weird roar I had never heard followed. I will never forget that sound. Smokey was hurt, and I doubted I would see him again. But what the hell was he fighting? Was it a bear? Maybe a big cat? Finally, the dog burst from the brush in midair, and it sailed several feet before hitting the ground. And it rolled and tried to right itself, but Smokey couldn't get up. Dad snatched me up by the collar, and he dragged me backwards to the truck. The tailgate was down and the topper lid was open, and he threw me in there, all the while calling to the dog that had finally gotten on its feet and was limping toward us. Dad stood between the truck and Smokey and began firing into the brush until his pistol was empty. Smokey had made it to Dad by then, and by the collar, Dad drugged Smokey and threw him in the bed of the truck with me. And then he ran to the cab and came back with a shotgun, and he fired 3 more shots into the brush. He was now out of shells, and Dad slammed the truck bed shut and then sprinted to the cab. I heard the truck start, and then I felt the truck lurch forward and watched gravel sling out behind us, and we took off out of the campground, leaving all of our stuff there. There was a stretch of road we needed to traverse before climbing a hill that would take us out of the area, and it gave me time to watch out the back to see this thing step out into the clear. I could not believe it. There was a creature taller than any man I know, and it stood motionless, arms to its sides, and it watched as we left. I didn't know what it was back then, but I do now. It was covered in hair and had thick arms and legs, and I think my jaw hung open for an hour. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen. Just when the truck was about to take me out of that field of view, I watched it turn and walk away from the camp and into the creek, and then there was nothing but dust swirling behind the truck. We drove for 30 minutes, and finally my father stopped and came back to check on us. Smokey lay there beside me, panting. He was hurt. There was no way to know how bad. To my surprise, Dad said that we would be staying right there for the night. He wasn't going to leave all that gear in the woods. It had value, he said, and we would sleep here and then go back and get our stuff the next day. We were 5 hours from home here, so I guess it made sense. And I spent that night curled up with my dog in the front seat of that truck while Dad never slept, his pistol now reloaded and in his lap, and was ready for use if we had any further trouble. The next morning, I let Smokey out the door, and I was thrilled to see that he was walking and sniffing the area and peeing all over the place. It appeared that he would make it. Other than him moving a bit slower than usual, he was going to be okay. 30 minutes later, we arrived at the campsite once again. We sat in the truck and watched from a distance. Our gear was strewn about, and the site looked nothing like it had the day before, but Dad wanted to wait and watch and make sure the area was clear. Finally, he drove on down into the site, and he got out and he began gathering our stuff while Smokey and I stayed put. And while he dragged everything to the truck, I could see that it was all torn up. Even the cooler we had hung bear-proof lay on the ground and was broken into several pieces. Once everything was loaded, we left, and I was glad to get out of there. What a creepy place that area turned out to be after all those times we had camped there. The next day was Monday, and Dad called in to the Fish and Game people to report the incident. I heard him tell the person on the phone that a bear had attacked our campsite. Well, I knew it wasn't a bear, but I didn't say a word. Later that week, 3 men from the agency came to our house, and I listened while they spoke in the living room. They had visited the site, and I heard them specifically say that it was not a bear that had torn up our camp, and that they were sure my father knew that. Well, he didn't know it, because he didn't see what I saw. He was driving. I was about to walk in the room and tell them what I had seen when I heard one of the men say, "It doesn't matter at this point what you saw, sir. What matters is that this will be classified as a bear attack no matter what, and we would appreciate it if you would leave it that way and not talk about it to anyone." Well, I couldn't see my dad in the other room, but I'm sure he must have had a confused expression on his face as he told them that he would keep it quiet. The discussion he had with my mother later was quite animated. Dad just could not understand what the hell was going on. But in the end, I suppose it didn't have a huge impact on his life. Not so much that he would pursue the truth as some sort of a crusade. Why would he do that? If they didn't want him talking about a bear tearing up our camp, so what? He went on with his life. For the next few days, I thought about that day in the woods and everything we had been through. The image of that creature is still as vivid today as it was the day it happened. And then there was the game and fish people and what I overheard them say, and it stayed on my mind for many days. And I finally decided not to say anything to my father. There were a few other reasons I kept silent on this, but mainly what would have been the point. It's now over 30 years later, and I'm finally revealing this thing that I have kept to myself all these years. It feels good to tell someone. Well, to tell many thousands at one time if you choose to share this story in a video. It's finally out. I was chased out of a campground by a Bigfoot. Every word is the truth. Oh man, what a story. Now, this encounter is... any encounter with a Bigfoot is quite spectacular, but this encounter is one that, you could classify it as probably your typical Bigfoot encounter. The dog probably provoked the Bigfoot. If the dog hadn't been there, maybe they would have never seen it. Who knows? There's no way to know. But what's cool is this kid kept this to himself all these years. And he was smart enough to know that it just didn't make any difference whether he told anyone or not. Now he's much older and he's like, I'd like to tell this story. He's not claiming PTSD or anything like that, although he may have some. That's possible. But I don't get that from his email. What I am getting is that he kind of smiled and had a good experience. He kept it to himself, and now he's telling all of us about it. And what a great treat that is. So I appreciate him sending the email. It was really good. Man, just a good story. Okay, here's another one from an anonymous writer, but this woman is, I think this happened in Texas. I know she lives in Texas now, but here's what she writes. In 1990, my husband and I moved to Bentonville, Arkansas from Texas. Okay, the event takes place in Arkansas, close to Bentonville, up in the northwest part of the state. She writes, my parents helped us load the U-Haul. Dad, my husband, and my little brother went in the truck, and me and Mom and my sister were in the car. There's a turnpike that starts near Paris, Texas, and it goes to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it's called the Indian Nation Turnpike. This turnpike in 1990 was the loneliest road in Oklahoma. Mom said that I should get some sleep and I could take the wheel in Muskogee. I was asleep when I heard my mother scream, "What the hell was that?" With sleepy eyes, I could see that she was pale with fear. Maybe it was amazement, and I told her to stop and let me drive, but she wouldn't. Dad stopped at the gas station in McAllister, and he looked worried. He and my mother hugged each other, and he said, "No one says a word." Well, we were all asleep, so none of us had seen it. And later, Mom told me in the car that she had seen an 8-foot-tall naked man covered in hair walking on the side of the road, and when we passed it, it ran between our two cars. I guess my father had seen it too, but he didn't say anything. My mother swore it was a Bigfoot up until the day she passed away. We never told our kids this story until my son had his encounter. Willis, Texas is like any small town, and when we moved here, the population was 4,000 people. We moved to a neighborhood of mobile homes, and it was wooded in some spots and heavily wooded on the north side of the street. In that area, a young boy could explore to his heart's content. Sam Houston National Forest is connected to those woods. One day my son and his friend came into the house and they were breathing hard and scared to the point that he was shaking. I asked them what had happened, but his friend kept telling me that he just wanted to go home. My husband told him that he would take him home, but he said he had called his dad and they were going to meet us on the trail. At this time, my son was 11 years old. My energetic, talkative boy was quiet, and he went to his room and he shut the door. My husband and I were concerned, so we went in to talk to him. He had closed the blinds and curtains and sat in the dark, and when we came in, he asked us not to turn the lights on, but he knew that I have a phobia of the dark, so he turned on his lamp. He kept saying, "Please believe me, I know what I saw." And we said, "Well, tell us what you saw, and we will believe you." He and his friends went to do their boy things in the woods, exploring and all, and soon it was getting late, and the other boys decided to head home, and he and another friend decided to check a pond to see if there were any fish jumping. Then they heard footsteps in the woods. They thought maybe it was an animal, like a deer or a cow, but then they figured out it was walking toward them. And then they heard a whistle, and then the walking stopped. His friend told him that he was getting spooked, and they decided to walk back to their bikes. And then the thing started walking beside them in the woods. Well, my son looked over and he saw something red and dark in the trees. He said it was tall, and he kept telling his friend to walk faster. He knew if he ran, this thing would chase after him. Finally, they got to their bikes and they took off. They could hear the creature running beside them in the woods still. And at one point, his friend's chain broke on the bike. My son stopped long enough for his friend to run and jump on the bike. And at that time, he looked over and there was a face of a human ape man looking right at him from the woods. He said the teeth were the scariest thing about it. Well, my son took off, and when he looked back in the mirrors of his bike, this thing stepped out in the road. He said he about peed his pants, but he kept on going until he got to the house. And then he looked at me and he said, "Mom, this thing is real and it's here." 2 days later, I was doing dishes late at night. I had 6 children in the house, and they were all teens except this one son. And it was the only time I could really clean and watch TV. I looked out the window because my dog was whimpering and scratching at the door. That was weird because he loved being outside. Well, I went to the door and he ran inside. And then I looked toward the woods and I saw something in the dark, and it was moving and it was big. I slowly closed the door and I locked it and I ran to my daughter. My husband was working nights then, and she turned off the lights and we looked out the window and she saw it too. I told my husband, but he told us that we were imagining it. And then one night taking out the trash, something happened to him. I don't know what it was, but what I do know is he said that we're moving. Years later, my son told me that the creature knew where we lived because it waited for him to come outside, but he never did. He is a father now, and when I go to Bigfoot conferences, it is for him and my mother. He tells me, "I know you believe me, Mama. Thank you." Well, he's one tough young man, but look into his eyes and you know the event is very real. Thank you for reading my email. Please don't use my name. This is Texas, but we are very well known in this small town. And she signs off. And I would never use anybody's name, especially if they ask me not to. But that's a great story. I mean, this happened in 1990. I guess it all happened in 1990. And I think I'm a little confused on it. The first thing was on the way to Bentonville. And the second event, I'm scanning back through the email to see Willis, Texas. We never told my kids, blah, blah, blah. So the story's chilling. So I don't know exactly when the next encounter was. She wasn't really clear on that. But at any rate, this was a good story, ma'am. And I hope you hear it, and I hope you appreciate the way I did it, because I read it word for word, just like you sent it to me. But thank you again for the story. Thank you for joining me on this podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it that you've listened this far. I'll be back with another one in a day or two, and until then, you guys have a good week. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you.